Hey guys, this is Nia and I'm here with another easy food tutorial. Today I will be painting cookies. These are so easy and fun to paint. I'm going to show you a few varieties and you can basically doodle a whole page of these cookies once you get the hang of it. Let's first begin by drawing out the basic shape, which is a circle. Try to avoid oval shapes. You want a more rounded and circular shape for this one. Then what you want to do is make the lines a bit crooked so the sides look sort of uneven, because cookies are usually not perfectly round unless it's like a sugar cookie and it usually has cracks and things like that. And then I'm going to add smaller circles again, and this doesn't have to be perfect. You want to vary the size and the shapes, and those are basically the chocolate chips. I'm just going to draw a few more of these so you get a better idea. Notice that some of the sides are really caved in, and in those areas I like to place some chocolate chips. This adds a bit more dimension to your cookies and it doesn't look as flat because you're not only getting the front view of the chocolate chips but also from the sides. You can also vary how the cookies are going to be presented. As you can see, I'm going to put a bite mark on the side, and this is going to give it a bit of interest when we're painting it later. I'm also going to paint half cookies and also a quarter, so you can really vary the shapes here. So if you decide to turn this into a full page pattern, you can have many different varieties of elements to play around with. Let's go straight to the colors of the cookies. The colors I used are cadmium orange, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and sepia. They're all from my Holbein set, but the cadmium orange is Winsor & Newton. I'm also going to be using my Winsor & Newton white gouache for highlights. I'm going to show you the color mixtures that I used. For the cookie base, I mixed in yellow ochre with a bit of cadmium orange. This makes the yellow ochre a bit warmer and it gives a nice golden color. Then for some of the burnt edges or a bit of the shadows, I added some burnt sienna into the cadmium orange and the yellow ochre mixture. And I'm also going to go over the chocolate chip colors, which are very simple. It's basically burnt sienna with sepia. You can add a bit more burnt sienna if you want to make milk chocolate, and if you want to make the chocolate look a bit darker, add a bit more sepia. That's basically the color of the cookies. Now I'm going to show you how I will be painting them. So firstly, I want to make sure I like the base color that I have, and I'm going to mix in a thin to medium consistency of the yellow ochre and cadmium orange. And for this, I'm just going to paint by doing circular motions until I get somewhat of a circular shape for the cookie base. I'm also leaving a touch of white negative space in some areas so the base doesn't look too flat. Then I'm making the second mixture now. So I'm going to mix in burnt sienna into our first color mix, and then you can adjust the darkness and the lightness using the ratio. You can add more burnt sienna if you want it darker and vice versa. Then while the base color is still a touch damp, like the paper is still a bit cold to the touch, you can start painting curved lines around and follow the roundness of the cookie. After this, you may add another layer until you're satisfied with the vibrancy of the color, but because this is just an example, I'm going to go straight into the chocolate chips, and I'm just going to paint them randomly in different spots. It would be nice if the base color is fairly dry, but if some areas are a touch damp, I think the paint traveling also make it look like the melted chocolate is traveling inside of the cracks of the cookies, and I find that quite appealing, but in the end it's really up to you. So for this next one, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to leave out a bite mark, but the steps are basically the same. First is the base color using the circular brush strokes. Then on the second and third layer, I'm going to paint the texture of the cookie cracks, and then moving on to the chocolate chips. Once all the painting has dried up, I'm going to freshly squeeze some white gouache, and it's important to use freshly squeezed paint because this is where you can get the full opacity of the white for highlights. So once you understand the brush strokes and the basic shape of the cookie, we're going to move on to the painting, and this is where I will vary the cookie shapes, like the bitten cookies or one where it's snapped in two or in a quarter. You can make any sort of different ones, so you don't have to follow exactly what I'm going to paint if you wish to experiment yourself. When I paint a whole bunch of cookies, I tend to paint every couple of cookies separately. This way, the first layer of paint is not completely dry yet, so I can still make the slight wet on wet effect with the second layer of paint. And I just repeat this in the places where I want the cookies to be, so you can also paint them individually if you want to, but this just depends on how fast your paint is drying and how you can manage your time to get the desired effect that you want. You can keep going back and forth on your cookies if you feel like they're drying up a bit too light for your liking, and you just keep building up the layers of darker brown until you're fine with the vibrancy, because you know that when watercolor dries, it does dry a bit lighter. But what I'm going to do with this painting is to finish the rough composition first, then I'm going to paint the chocolate chips before adding more layers, since the chocolate chips are going to be a very thick consistency dark brown, and after that I get to balance out the darkness of the cookie folds depending on how rich the color of the chocolate chips are. You can add contrast before too, but I just like knowing how much I need to darken certain folds because the chocolate chips will give you more of an idea of how to balance the overall cookies. I feel like it's still a bit empty, so I ended up adding another cookie here, but you don't really have to follow my composition. I'm just working with what I have here. I don't have anything in mind. I'm just seeing if it's a bit empty, I add more cookies, or you may even add some cookie crumbles. So you don't really have to follow what I painted here, but you may if you would like. But the great thing about this simple shape of the cookies is that you can really get creative as you don't need to think about too much of the paint technicalities. So I hope you get to create your own interpretation of this painting. You can also use this to turn into a pattern if you repeat the shapes, or like a full page doodle if you're running out of ideas of what to paint. Anyway, as you can see here, the paint is now dry and it has turned way lighter than when we initially put down the paint. So here I've mixed my burnt sienna with a bit of sepia, and I'm going to place down the chocolate chips. For these cookies, I ended up waiting for the initial layer to dry, so I don't get the runny melted chocolate effect. But if you would like to create that look and your initial layer is already dry, you can apply a bit of clean water with your brush to where you want the dark brown to run, and then place the paint in that area. As long as the area is wet, the paint will travel accordingly. Or another way is to actually place down the dark brown colors while the previous layer is still a bit cold to the touch. If the base layer is puddling and very wet, you should wait a bit longer. If not, the dark brown will just run too much into other areas and it might create a mess. And once I've placed down the dark brown colors for the chocolate chips, as you can see, it stands out a bit too much compared to the initial layer of the cookies, which are lighter because it's now completely dry. So I'm going to add the dark brown mixture of the cookies again and repaint some of the folds in each of the cookies. Just paint in some areas. You don't have to paint the whole thing again, or else it might look too flat. So just redefine some of the folds that you already created before. So now that I have my main cookies, I'm going to add some additional elements just to give it a bit more dynamic into the painting. So for this, I'm going to create crumb shapes. They're very random shapes, but I'm not trying to make them rounded, as crumbs or cookie pieces are usually crumbly, so I try to make really uneven shapes. Some edges are sharp, where some are just a bit jagged. I'm not putting too much thought into the shapes, but rather where I place them. I'm going to treat this the same way as I painted the cookies. So I will add shadows using the same color and also some pieces of the chocolate chips and some of the crumbs. I decided to add a larger piece here because I thought that that place was a bit too empty. So this is really depending on your composition. You can add bigger crumb pieces like this one too if you need to fill in a bit more of the empty space. I think I'm fairly happy with the composition now. I don't want to make this demo too complicated, but depending on your level or the stage of your painting, you may add some more shadows on top of this layer that you made to make more detail, or crumbs to finish off the composition. And once you're happy, you can join me with the next step. Here I'm going to use my white gouache, and I'm going to use my smallest brush. This is a size 0, and I'm using freshly squeezed white gouache paint to get the full opacity of the color to paint the highlights on the chocolate chips. And for this, I'm just going to add dots or tiny lines where some of the chocolate chips are. So you can pretty much finish here, but as extra detail, I'm just going to add some shadows for this. So I'm going to mix in some burnt sienna, mineral violet, and also some manganese blue, so the purple isn't too warm, to create this purpley brown tone for the shadows. And I'm going to lighten the color by adding water for a thinner consistency. Take your time while mixing the paint until you get the right tone that you want. I've been liking purple for shadows recently, but you may also use blues or grays depending on your taste. Then I'm going to use my brush that I previously used for the cookies, and I'm going to place the shadows. As a final note, when you're painting the shadows, make sure to paint all of the shadows at the same angle so the painting looks more uniform. And because we're using quite a light consistency for this, if you're scared of making the shadows a bit too dark, you can swatch the paint first before you put it down on scrap paper. And that's basically it. This is a super easy painting for all levels, including beginners, and it's just something fun to paint if you want to doodle on your watercolor sketchbook. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I will see you at the next video. Bye!